Bonjour and welcome to episode 11 of the French Revolution vlogcast, and today we've reached the Directory. Last time we talked about the collapse of the Terror, the fall of Robespierre in July 1794, and today we're looking at the first phase of the Directory. Really, in this period between 1794 and 1799, you have two main areas of analysis. The first one is how successful were the Directory, looking at those sort of change continuity themes. And the second is, why is it that the Directory end up being overthrown in the coup Brumaire by Napoleon? In this vlogcast, we're going to look and think about mostly the positives of the Directory and those reasons that you could say that they were quite successful. And next time we're going to think more about the negatives and why it is that they end up being undone by Napoleon and Abbé Sieyès. Firstly, I just want to remind you of the context under which the Directory came to power. In fact, the Directory don't come immediately to power in July 1794. There is this period of Thermidorian government from July 1794 up to when they bring in the new 1795 constitution in August 1795. And that's really when the Directory starts in that August time. And the context really straddles four things. Firstly, control. They have a limited amount of control as a government during the period in the run-up to the Directory, and that's exemplified really by the White Terror. In the White Terror, it's a sort of retaliatory, revenge-fueled terror by the Jeunesse Dorée, the Gilded Youth, upon the Jacobins. In some places it seems very vindictive and very violent, in other places a bit less so. But this is a period of time certainly where the government is unable or unwilling to check the the Jeunesse Dorée running amok in a more limited way than the sans-culottes had before that. About 2,000 people are thought to have died in this period. So control is the first way. Secondly, the fear of dictatorship is a big part of the context under which the Directory come to power. And we'll talk about that when we think about the Constitution in a couple of minutes. Thirdly, the economy is getting worse and worse. As we talked last time, it was a feature in the declining confidence people had in Robespierre and his government. The Thermidorian government tried to address this by ending price controls in December 1794. Predictably and unfortunately, the bad winter of 1794-95 and the ending price controls leads to inflation, spiralling prices, and the government responded to that by printing more money, which, if you've ever studied any part of economic history, you'll know is a very bad idea, and just devalues the currency even further. So that by May 1795, still before the Directory take charge properly, the assignat, the currency, had lost 96% of its value, and 20% of Paris were living on bread handouts, or living off bread handouts, food relief. And so the economy was in a really bad state, and that's part of the context under which the Directory come into power. And the third thing, so control, fear of dictatorship, the economy, and of course the war. And the war actually was going better, is the one bright spot for the Directory when they take charge. In June 1794, the Battle of Fleurus had really ended the conflict in the Austrian Netherlands in France's favour. The Dutch Republic made peace in January 1795, and then the Peace of Basel later on ended the war with the Prussians and the Spanish as well. So in this context, control was an issue. There were worries about the sort of government that the Directory would be. The economy was a massive issue, and the war was an ongoing issue, but something that looked like it might be more successful. So how did the Directory do in these four areas? Well, if we start with control, actually, I think their record is fairly decent. There were, before they come to power still, there were risings of Germinal and of Prairial in April and May 1795, April and May 1795 in Germinal and Prairial. Now, these were Parisians coming out and demanding bread, sans-culottes effectively coming out and demanding bread and surrounding the government buildings, and in a way that we've seen before in the French Revolution. But this time, on both occasions, the government deal with it firmly and effectively. The demonstrators are sent packing, some of them arrested. They promise to look into the price problems but they retain a sense of law and order. And this carries on under the Directory. In the Vendémiaire uprising, 25,000 people rise up against the government, but the government responds by using force and sending the army out into the streets. And although it's kind of a brutal and savage put down, and they have to do that, so that's not a great sign, they do that. They retain control. So it's not good that they have to, but they do it effectively, ruthlessly, and efficiently. And you might remember this is the first occasion when Napoleon gets into action in Paris, and he fires his grape shot down the street into the protesters. The Babeuf plot is probably the low point of rebellion against the directors, and the high point for the directors. This is a proposed rebellion by Gracchus Babeuf, a sort of proto-socialist, communist type figure. And he completely fails to get any support at all. This is in May 1796, and he is arrested, and the whole thing is dealt with very straightforwardly. From this point on, I'm not saying there are no law and order problems, but really things settle down in a way that is very different than the earlier years of the French Revolution, where uprisings, violence, demonstrations on the street are quite the run of the order. Part of this is to do with martial law, which was imposed in June 1795. So they're taking measures that we would find draconian and measures that we would find unsettling in the 21st century. But in the context of the time, there is relative stability in terms of the control of the country. Moving on from that, the second big fear starting out the Directory was that it would open itself up to being sort of a new dictatorship. People had been very worried about Robespierre emerging from the Committee of Public Safety and becoming this dictatorial figure. And so this 1795 constitution was set up deliberately to avoid that. There were two elected houses, the Council of Ancients, the Council of 500. There was 5 directors that sat over them, and they were to form the executive. So the Council of Ancients, the Council of 500, were in charge of passing legislation, making new laws, and the directors, to keep them away from that system and process, were really just in charge of enforcing the laws. Now, there were massive problems with that, but it did do its job in terms of avoiding dictatorship. And the 5 directors were replaced one a year on a ballot system, like a straw was pulled out, a randomised ballot system, so that it seems a bit silly in some ways, but so that every year you couldn't tell who was going to survive. It meant that there was no certainty that any one director could survive and end up dominating the whole thing. Now, I'm not saying again that that's a perfect system, but it does avoid that problem of dictatorship, which is one of the things we do, and in that sense, it's a success. Secondly, it also avoids or reduces, neuters really, the influence of the sans-culottes. Every man over the age of 21 has a vote, but they vote for electors, and it's the electors who actually choose the representatives for the Council of 500 and the Council of Ancients. To become an elector, you need to pay quite a lot of tax, and effectively, you need to be one of the wealthy elite. So anyone over 21 could pick which wealthy nobleman was going to take a part in this democracy. So there's democracy there, but it's a sort of democracy that is designed to reduce the influence of the mob, the sans-culottes. So success in those terms. Thirdly, the economy, which we saw was probably the biggest problem for the Directory when it took charge. And again, there are some successes here. The assignat had reduced hugely in value, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, and that was replaced in February 1796 with a new paper currency, the mandats territoriaux. However, this did not work, and that's certainly a blip in the record of the Directory. They had lost their value so much that they were down to 5% of their value by July 1796, and they have to be replaced 6 months later in February 1797 with a metal currency. Effectively, this is going back to coins. Now, the problem with that is they're going back to the coins they had before, and actually a lot of those coins had left the country with the emigres, or they'd been put in deposits or dug into holes in people's gardens, and they weren't in circulation. So actually that led to price deflation. So in terms of currency circulation, there are certainly problems with the policy of the Directory. But two bigger successes for them are in September 1797, when they bring in when they effectively declare France bankrupt and write off 2/3 of the debts of France. Now, this is very unpopular with the creditors, as you might imagine, but it does stabilise the French economy. Up to that point, the interest payments that France had been paying per annum were 240 million francs, but they were reduced to 80 million francs at a stroke. So that's a quarter of government expenditure before that had been just on interest payments on debt. And now here, in an unpopular move amongst financiers, but an effective pragmatic move, the French government, the Directory government, managed to solve that problem. The impact of that was that in October 1797, for the first time in the French Revolution, the budget is balanced because of this measure. The second measure that the finance team bring in, Vincent Ramel led, he was the finance minister and led this, was to reform taxation. Taxation had been made more fair under the Republic, but had not been very effective. And so Ramel brings in 4 direct taxes: a direct tax on land, one on trading licenses, one on movable property, and one on doors and windows. These are so successful that they last up to the First World War as a set of taxes. He also centralised tax collection. It had been being delegated to local authorities, but now it's brought under the control of the central government in Paris, and that makes it a more effective system too. He also reintroduces an indirect tax, which is extremely unpopular, but it again helps them to balance the budget. So they're unpopular in this sense. Nobody likes taxation, but they are effective, and that should certainly be remembered up to 1797. Finally, and really briefly, because I'm running out of time, the war continues to go well, and you'll remember that Napoleon's Italian campaign deals with the Austrians and defeats them, and in October 1797, the Treaty of Campo Formio is arguably the high point of the Directory. We might mention that next time, but until then, thanks for watching. See you again soon.